Hey everybody, Hoosier Jedi here with another review for you. This is going to be the review for the winner of my contest from earlier this week, where you, the viewer, got to choose which show I would review. And as promised, I took the entries, used a random number generator, and the winning show was suggested by LaFlux, and that was the show Spider-Man Unlimited. So as promised, in just a minute, I will give you guys my review of the first two episodes of that show. But before I get into that, I got one more quick announcement for you. I only did get 8 entries into this contest, which was pretty much in the ballpark of what I was expecting. So that being the case, and the fact that a lot of the shows that I'm reviewing, like Game of Thrones and Green Lantern the Animated Series, are going to be wrapping up their seasons very shortly, that's going to leave me with a little bit of a gap in the amount of reviews that I do. I've been tossing around ideas for what I could do to fill that gap, and I ultimately decided, what the heck, I will review all of those shows. Now again, guys, I have to remind you that the entry is obviously passed. So while you can certainly send me suggestions for other shows that I might want to check out, anything further that you send me, I cannot promise to review. So it is just going to be Spider-Man Unlimited and the other 7 shows that I already have on the list. Now, as for when those reviews will be out, I can't give you a firm date on any of that. I will get them out. I'll get them out when I get them out, but I promise you I will eventually do them. So anyway, that said, let's dive into Spider-Man Unlimited. Now, since I am just going off the 2 episodes here, I'm just going to give you a quick rundown on the basic premise of the show. And this show was created shortly after the end of the very popular, very well-received Spider-Man cartoon from the early to mid-90s. And it is considered a broad strokes sequel to that. You know, there are a few little very vague references to the previous show, but more or less the show goes off on its own direction. And boy, does it really go off on its own direction. In a nutshell, what happens is Spider-Man is observing J. Jonah Jameson's son, John Jameson, getting ready to go off on a space mission to the recently discovered planet of Counter-Earth, which is hidden on the opposite side of the sun. And while he's watching all this, the shuttle take off, he sees Venom and Carnage, his longtime nemesis, sneak onto the ship. Spider-Man goes and tries to stop them, but he fails. The shuttle is lost. The public turns against Spider-Man, spearheaded by J. Jonah Jameson, blaming him for the loss of a heroic astronaut. Spider-Man, as always, driven by intense guilt, decides that it is his responsibility to go and rescue John Jameson. So he steals some nanites from Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four, tinkers with them to create himself a new, really bizarre-looking Spider-Man costume with additional technological powers. Then he steals another space shuttle that was intended for the rescue mission and goes off to Counter-Earth, where he discovers that this Earth is ruled by beast people called the Bestiamorphs, and their leader, the High Evolutionary, and that humans are an oppressed minority who are struggling to form a revolution to take the planet back, and that this revolution is now led by John Jameson. And so Peter Parker finds himself kind of caught in this weird up-and-coming revolution situation. So yeah, that is the basic premise with which Spider-Man Unlimited operates. This show only did last about 13 episodes. There were supposedly more in the works, but the show basically got obliterated in the ratings by Pokemon, so the executives pulled the plug on it. So okay, that is the basic backstory of what's going on with Spider-Man Unlimited. So let's get into the actual story itself. And I got my notes right here, so if you see me looking off to the side a lot, this is what I'm doing. So anyway, one of the first things I notice is that in the story, one of the first things that people do is that they send a probe off to Counter-Earth to check it out. I mean, actually, this is the probe that actually discovers Counter Earth. And the probe, shortly after doing so, is shot down and destroyed by the folks from Counter Earth. Now, the people on normal Earth, including John Jameson, immediately interpret this as hostile action. And, okay, I can understand why they might be a little freaked out that they shot their satellite down, but keep in mind, they know nothing about the political situation on this planet. All they know is that these people saw some unknown spacecraft of some sort in their atmosphere and shot it down, which realistically is probably what we would do if we saw some unknown aircraft flying around our space. I mean, heck, it's been documented that the militaries across the world, from the United States to Belgium to wherever, have done exactly this sort of thing. It's been made, it's turned up in more than one documentary about UFOs that I've seen. So just assuming that the people of Counter Earth are in some way hostile to the people of normal Earth just because they acted in what could very reasonably be described as self-defense seems extraordinarily foolish and just flat out jingoistic at worst. Anyway, so my next point with this is that while John is going off to explore Counter Earth and all this, first of all, NASA, the United States government, the United Nations, they decide, okay, let's send a spaceship to this planet. A spaceship with a crew consisting of apparently one guy. And let's do that instead of, say, sending another probe with whose job it is to broadcast a message of peace saying, or at least try and open a dialogue with the people of Counter Earth. Now, I know that this is a kid's show and all of that, but really, the way they're going about this does seem really dumb. And even if you say, okay, it's a kid's show, they wouldn't do that level of thinking on it, it still doesn't change the fact that what they do choose to do is send a spaceship crewed entirely by one guy. And what exactly is he supposed to do? I mean, was he supposed to go over there and open diplomatic negotiations? Well, last time I checked, John Jameson is an astronaut. He is not a diplomat. In fact, if I understand it correctly, astronauts are usually guys called from the United States Air Force. So, yeah, he is really in no way, shape, or form qualified to do much of anything over there other than fight, which is really exactly the wrong message to send to the people of Counter Earth, whoever they might be. So anyway, to get into one of the show's good points is very early on when Peter Parker changes into Spider-Man. For the very first time, we hear some of the classic guitar riff from the 90s Spider-Man cartoon, which was certainly a very nice shout out to the fans and a good touch. I will give them that. Continuing on, actually, let's just step aside entirely and talk about, since they're one of the weaker aspects of the show, let's just get the whole talking about what's going on with Venom and Carnage out of the way. Okay, first of all, this cartoon's version of Venom it's all right. It is fairly in keeping with him in the comics. This reality's version of Carnage, however, makes no sense. He's drawn to look like this weird, almost skeletal kind of creature who, for some reason, has bones sticking out of him, even though Carnage is supposed to be a creature who's basically able to become almost liquid at will, and is never been shown to have bones sticking out of him. That makes absolutely no sense. There's also the fact that Venom and Carnage are cooperating, something that they are absolutely, utterly loath to do in the comics, and that they're working apparently for something called the Synaptic, which is using them to place little bits of symbiote of themselves on people and turn them into their zombie slaves. Now, seeing as how this is we only get 2 episodes, I only go 2 episodes into the show, we don't really get a whole lot of insight as to who the Synaptic is and what it is they want. So, I can't really criticize the show too much there, because, again, I've only seen 2 episodes. But this just seems like such a radical departure for what they do, what Venom and Carnage traditionally do. Now, Venom is a character that's bounced back between being a villain, being a good guy, the so-called lethal protector from the 90s that I think everybody would kind of like to forget about. But then there's so much about comic books from the 90s we'd all like to forget about. And Carnage, Carnage's thing is that he just basically likes to go around and kill people in horribly violent ways. That's it. That's Carnage's deal. Nothing more, nothing less. And that's part of the reason I like Carnage in a lot of ways. He's just crazy and likes to kill people. You don't really need any deeper motivation than that sometimes. So anyway, yeah. Not hugely wild about that. And there's some other things that happen here that I thought were kind of dumb. Like, for example, Venom and Carnage break into a space shuttle, and this apparently not only does not damage the ship in any way, shape, or form. I mean, they literally tear a door open into a space shuttle that is heading into orbit and enter it, and this causes no kind of alarms to go off and alert the pilot or any kind of mechanical problems in the ship whatsoever. Now look, not to play light with real-world tragedies, but we've seen space shuttles destroyed on national TV. It's happened. We've seen this more than once. We know that these are not exactly... These ships are in situations where if something goes wrong, it can easily domino into a disaster that can destroy the ship and unfortunately kill everyone on board. And it just really kind of leaves a bad taste in my mouth, I guess, to see this sort of thing just sort of glossed over. Okay, so I'm just going to leave it at that. Another thing, apparently, I did get a laugh when Spider-Man was, of course, being hounded by the public, that he saves a lady who then proceeds, a lady with very, very 1980s sort of hair, in a show that was made in 1999. He saves the lady, and then she promptly maces him. Now, that was pretty darn funny, and I think that's probably been done in the comics, but it was a very good moment there. So anyway, continuing on, another thing that bothered me is that Spider-Man, in order to get this new suit, okay, for some reason he decides he needs a new suit, he goes and steals a bunch of nano things from Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four. Alright, now first of all, the Fantastic Four, out of all the other among superhero teams in the Marvel Universe, are the ones that Spider-Man traditionally has the closest association with. In fact, the Human Torch, Johnny Storm, is one of Spider-Man's closest friends. Now, okay, I can understand why they would not want to make the Fantastic Four a big deal in a show that is about Spider-Man. I do like the fact that they name-checked Reed Richards and all of that. But it just sort of bothers me as a fan of the comics that Spider-Man simply didn't ask the Fantastic Four for help. In fact, he decides to take a page out of the Fantastic Four's book and steal a space shuttle all by himself, even though it would have made infinitely more sense to just ask the Fantastic Four to take him to Counter-Earth and to maybe give him a hand. They are, among all superheroes in the Marvel Universe, easily the most qualified. They are far more qualified to deal with this situation than Spider-Man is. But of course, Spider-Man is a character who is driven by guilt, specifically the guilt, of course, of the death of Uncle Ben. And seeing that guilt drive Spider-Man to do this, I mean, it does somewhat make sense in character, but he just seems to be so horribly, horribly reckless and running off half-cocked with everything. But I'll talk some more about that in a minute. So again, Peter steals the technology from Reed Richards, which stealing technology from fellow superheroes really doesn't seem like something that Spider-Man would do. And then not only does he do this, he somehow knows how to reprogram nanobots to create a new Spider-Man suit for him, a suit that can do things like turn him invisible and give out sonic attacks. Oh yeah, and apparently at some point along the way, Spider-Man learned how to pilot a space shuttle, as well as how to hack a space shuttle so that he could steal it. Now, granted, in the comics, it's established that Peter is a very brilliant guy, a very smart guy. But at least the way I always read it, it was shown that his main area of scientific expertise lay in biochemistry. Here, Peter is showing that he apparently has degrees in things like physics, nanotechnology, electrical engineering, computer science. I mean, he'd really have to be about as smart as Reed Richards to pull all of this off, and as smart as Peter Parker is, he ain't that smart. So yeah. Anyway, okay, so after a brief and more or less pointless encounter with Nick Fury, who again is someone else who seemed to be willing to listen to Spider-Man out, hear Spider-Man out, and may have in fact even been willing to help him out if he had just talked to him rather than running off into space half-cocked. Spider-Man ends up on Counter Earth, where his ship is pretty promptly destroyed, coming in for a landing, or well, actually, more or less gets shot down. Let's be completely accurate here. So after getting out of the ship, Spider-Man finds himself attacked by these guys called the Knights of Wundagore. The Knights of Wundagore are from the comics. They're not. They're actually, oddly enough, X-Men characters, more or less. And they are the creation of another guy who is an X-Men character called the High Evolutionary. And the Knights of Wundagore are, to put it bluntly, they're furries. They're sort of like furries meshed with characters who basically probably got tossed on the reject pile when somebody was coming up with ideas for characters for the old He-Man and the Masters of the Universe cartoon. No, look, I'm not huge experts on these characters, so if they do have actual counterparts in the comics. I think Lady Vermin actually might. I'm not 100% sure on that. But anyway, these guys just don't really feel like particularly interesting characters. And it's basically Spider-Man versus furries. Spider-Man versus furries flying around on high-tech hover motorcycles wearing crazy suits of armor with names like Sir Tiger and Lord Ram and Lady Vermin. It feels very weird, as many superhero comics as I've read, calling something that very obviously comes from the superhero tradition silly. But I'm sorry, but this is silly. As much as I love the X-Men comics, I've never particularly cared for the Knights of Wundagore because to me, they're silly. Okay? I just do not like the idea of superheroes going around beating up furries because, okay, frankly, I just plain don't like furries. Fine, send me hate mail on that one if you want. That's how I feel about it. Anyway, Spider-Man ultimately gets away and he gets captured, but manages to get away and hooks up with the Human Revolution, the obligatory ragtag bunch of freedom fighters. Who, even though, if I'm understanding what the show is telling me correctly, only about a week passes between the time John Jameson is lost and the time that Spider-Man manages to make his way to Counter Earth to rescue him. During this time, John has not only also met up with the human resistance, he has become their leader. Let me get this straight. Within about a week, he has become the leader of the entire resistance movement. Okay, are we sure this guy's name is not John Carter? I'm sorry, John Connor? Yeah. Okay, actually that's probably not a coincidence. It is, now that I think about it, really obvious to see more than a little bit of parallels between this and some of the stuff that we saw in the old Terminator movies, and of course Blade Runner. And actually, the show also feels a lot like what you might get if you were to take that tabletop game Shadowrun and replace the elves and the orcs and the gnomes and all that other crazy stuff with furries. You know what? I guess I should let you folks in on the fact that I don't particularly like Shadowrun either. But that's really more of a case of the fact that the one game that I played of it didn't go particularly well, and that I was playing with one of the guys that I played with was a really, really big jerk. But anyway, enough about my complaining about my gaming life. Let me see here. So let's move over and talk about the High Evolutionary himself. Here he really is not very much like the character he is in the comics, other than he's the creator of the Bestiamorphs, and he's just this guy who's obsessed with evolution and stuff. In the comics, he's this guy who runs around in crazy pink armor and hangs out on Mount Wundagore and a bunch of stuff. Here, he's just straight up Dr. Moreau. And I guess that was sort of the idea with the character in the comics. But just turning him into a generic old white guy with a beard, it sort of makes him look like evil, buff, dressed like a 90s character Santa Claus. So yeah, evil Dr. Moreau / Santa Claus. That's what they've turned the High Evolutionary into. Let's see. One other thing that I will give the show credit for, and this was just a little thing, if you pay attention to the freedom fighters running around, you can see quite clearly that one of them is intended to be the Counter-Earth version of Deborah Whitman. She's an old supporting character from the Spider-Man comics who, because of her somewhat minor role in the 90s Spider-Man show, I've always been oddly fond of. And I will give the show credit that it did do something that the 90s Spider-Man cartoon never did, in that it actually allowed the characters to use the word die. There is a part where John Jameson is literally going to kill some helpless bestiamorphs who they have captured. And of course, Spidey quickly talks him out of it. But just the fact that they were willing to go there to do something like that, it does speak well of the show that they were trying to push the envelope at least a little bit in some ways. Now, let's briefly talk about the art style of the show. Excuse me a sec. Honestly, I had some real issues here. First of all, the main one is, in some cases, the character designs, like particularly with Carnage, are just so out there, so radically different. It just doesn't feel right. And again, the whole thing with Counter-Earth and the Bestiamorphs, it really feels, honestly, as I said before, like they just stole a bunch of stuff that had been laying around from the offices of Masters of the Universe back in the 80s. I mean, seriously, it feels like they've taken Spider-Man and dumped him in a mediocre 80s cartoon. Even though Spider-Man did get a mediocre cartoon in the 80s. It's called Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. Yeah. Anyway. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. But anyway, the colors on this show. Honestly, I really was not impressed with the color work on this show. Sometimes it just looked really flat and dull. Other times the colors just looked incredibly garish and unpleasant. The character designs, like as I said, some of them are, like particularly Carnage, are just not all that great. Peter Parker, I didn't really care too much for the rather spiky, quote-unquote anime-esque haircut that they gave him. Other people like John Jameson and Aoko Yamada Jones, Akiko Yamada Jones, a character we also see briefly. She's all right. Mary Jane, all right. I mean, that is pretty much how I can really describe. The character designs, I think, range from bad to all right. Now, one of the things that I will give the show some credit for, and this is actually, I think, the show's strongest point, is the people behind it. I noticed that these two episodes were co-written by a writer I'm actually very familiar with and quite a fan of, a fellow by the name of Michael Reeves. He's had a hand in Batman the Animated Series, had a hand in Gargoyles, and he's also pretty well known for writing several very good Star Wars novels. One that he wrote solo is called Darth Maul Shadowhunter. It is a really, really good book. If you ever get the chance, check that out. And he's done other stuff with a fellow he works with a lot of the time, Steve Perry. They've done books like Death Star and Battle Surgeons, all very good Star Wars novels. And other folks that in the cast and who are quite good. We have Reno Romano as Peter Parker himself. He was Eduardo on Extreme Ghostbusters. He's Batman / Bruce Wayne on The Batman from a few years back. But to a lot of folks, including me, he will always be the English voice for Tuxedo Mask on the dub of Sailor Moon. Boy, that takes me back. And we also have Jennifer Hale as Mary Jane in this show. If that name sounds familiar to you, then you of course are probably a fan of Mass Effect, because she is the voice of Female Shepard in those games. She's also the voice of Bastila Shan in the Knights of the Old Republic games. Her descendant Satele Shan in Star Wars: The Old Republic, the MMO, where she also voices the female trooper. But as to me personally, Jennifer Hale will always be the voice of Elena, the rather prickly white mage priestess girl from the excellent video game Grandia 2. Again, that's another. If you ever get the chance, check that game out. It really does have like one of the absolute best battle engines of any video game I have ever played, and the story is actually pretty good too. But anyway, let's get into the overalls of this show. Overall, this show feels like the people that were behind it were honestly trying to make a good show. The problem is that they decided to try and reinvent the wheel. Basically, they turned Spider-Man into they're trying to turn Spider-Man into some sort of revolutionary on this weird alternate world, and no, that just doesn't work. That is not what Spider-Man is about. Now look, they've done, Spider-Man's done cosmic stories. I mean, there was even a collection of Spider-Man doing cosmic stuff. I think it was even called Spider-Man Cosmic Adventures, telling his more outer spacey, crazy cosmic stories from the comics all together in one. Something like this feels like something that they could do for like 3 or 4 issues in the comics, maybe even 5, and then it's time to take Spider-Man back to New York so he can go and punch Mysterio in the face again. Again, they're trying to take Spider-Man and just put him in an environment, in a situation that he is just, as a character, not suited for. This is not what Spider-Man does. Now, again, I'm only basing this on 2 episodes. But this is what my main problem with the show was. Yeah. So let's leave it at that. The show, as I said, it just tries to reinvent the wheel. It just ultimately ends up straying too far from what Spider-Man at its core is about, and how Spider-Man works well. So at the end of the day, did I like Spider-Man Unlimited? Well, I actually vaguely recall watching this show way back when at least these first couple of episodes, way back in 1999 when the first aired. And my impression then was, yeah, nice try, but no thanks. Well, it's been more than 10 years since then, and nice try, but no thanks is still my opinion. The folks here generally did seem to be trying to make a quality show, but they just went too far from what makes Spider-Man work, and ultimately to me, it just failed. So anyway, folks, I will thanks for watching this video. As always, please comment, rate, and subscribe. And until next time, take care and have a good one.